Cedar Rapids, Iowa. The evening of December 19, 1979. 18-year-old Michelle Martinko stood in a hotel ballroom at the Sheraton Inn, dressed for a banquet, not knowing it would be the last night of her life. She was a senior at Kennedy High School, a member of the concert choir, and that night she was there celebrating with the rest of the group, in a black jersey dress, black scarf, black pantyhose and heels, and a waist-length white and brown rabbit fur jacket her parents had given her. She carried a brown leather purse. By every account, she looked stunning that night, the kind of effortlessly put together that made other girls a little jealous and made her family a little proud. When the banquet ended, Michelle didn't go straight home. She asked a friend from the twirling squad if she wanted to come along to Westdale Mall, which had only recently opened in Cedar Rapids and quickly become the place to be seen. Michelle worked there, and she needed to pick up a new winter coat. Her friend couldn't come. So Michelle got into her family's tan 1972 Buick Electra alone and drove to the mall by herself. She got there sometime around 6:30 in the evening, and for the next hour or so, Michelle Martinko existed exactly the way any 18-year-old on a December night existed. Ordinary, unremarkable, alive. Around 7 o'clock, she ran into a group of old friends from elementary school, a boy named Tracy Price among them, on their way to see a movie. They stopped and talked. She told them she was there to pick up a coat. It was a completely normal conversation between people who'd known each other most of their lives. The kind of small moment nobody thinks to remember carefully, because why would you? Nobody in that conversation had any reason to believe it would be the last time any of them ever spoke to her. At some point after that conversation, in the parking lot of a mall full of holiday shoppers, under bright lights, within earshot of hundreds of people finishing their Christmas errands, someone got into that car with Michelle Martinko. And in the very short window of time between her last known sighting and the discovery of her body, that person stabbed her repeatedly, in the face and in the chest, hard enough to pierce both a lung and her aorta. She lost roughly a third of her blood before it was over. Her parents reported her missing around 2 in the morning when she hadn't come home. At around 4 a.m., Cedar Rapids police found the Buick parked in the northeast section of the Westdale Mall lot. Michelle was inside. Investigators who worked that scene in the freezing cold of an Iowa December would later describe the homicide as something that felt intensely personal. The kind of violence that doesn't usually come from a total stranger. And that single observation, that instinct that this was personal, would end up both true and almost completely useless for the next 39 years. Because whoever did this to Michelle Martinko had, as far as anyone could tell, no connection to her at all. Before we go further into what happened to her killer, it matters to understand who Michelle actually was, because this case, more than most, tends to get reduced to a mall parking lot and a knife. She was the younger of 2 daughters, an above-average student well regarded by her teachers, the kind of senior who was already being talked about with real affection by the adults at her school. She joined the twirling squad as a sophomore, sang in choirs, performed in theater productions. She was, by every description that survives her, talented and stylish and striking. And that description carried its own quiet cruelty, because some classmates apparently resented her for it. She didn't have a wide circle of close girlfriends, and people who knew her back then have speculated that some of that distance came from jealousy, over her looks, her clothes, sometimes over a boy she'd dated. She had plans, real ones. She intended to study interior design at Iowa State University after graduation. She had, in other words, an entire adult life already half sketched out in her head, waiting for her to step into it. She never got the chance. The investigation that followed her murder was intense, immediate, and, in the end, completely unable to produce a single suspect. Detectives worked the case hard through the early 1980s. They questioned people close to her, people who might have had a grudge, anyone connected to that mall on that night. Cedar Rapids is not a massive city, and a murder like this, a well-known, well-liked high school senior stabbed to death in her own family's car outside a shopping mall on a Wednesday night in December, tore through the community in a way that never fully healed. For decades, locals who were teenagers in 1979 would describe an entire generation of Cedar Rapids kids who grew up locking their car doors a little faster because of what happened to Michelle Martinko. And still, no arrest came, not in the 80s, not in the 90s. The case aged into local legend, the kind of story parents told their kids as a caution, without an ending anyone could give them. Detectives rotated through the department over those decades. Cases got reassigned, reopened, and quietly set aside again as leads dried up. But a case like this one rarely stays completely abandoned in a city the size of Cedar Rapids. There's almost always someone, eventually, who takes it personally. For this case, that someone was a Cedar Rapids police investigator named Matthew Denlinger, who inherited the file years after the murder and treated it less like an assignment and more like an obligation to a girl he'd never met. He was the one who kept pulling the box back out of storage, who kept pushing for new forensic techniques to be tried against evidence that was already older than most of the officers working the case. It's easy, watching a story like this from the outside, to imagine cold cases as static things, paperwork gathering dust until science magically catches up. In reality, most of them only move forward because somebody refuses to let them stay still. Denlinger was that somebody here. The break, when it eventually came, didn't come from a witness stepping forward or a deathbed confession. It came first from a piece of paper nobody had thought to look at closely enough. In 2006, a cold case investigator going back through the old file noticed something that had been sitting there the whole time. Unidentified blood on Michelle's dress. Blood that didn't belong to her. Whoever killed her had apparently been cut himself during the attack, likely by his own knife slipping in his grip during the struggle, and left a trace of his own blood behind on her clothing, 27 years earlier, without knowing it. Investigators developed a full DNA profile from that blood and ran it through CODIS, the National Criminal Database. Nothing. No hits. Whoever this was had never been arrested for anything serious enough to have his DNA on file anywhere in the country. For years after that, the case sat in almost the exact same place it had sat since 1979. A killer with a name nobody knew, a profile with nothing to match it to. The evidence itself, the dress, the blood samples, sat carefully preserved in an evidence room for over a decade beyond that, protected against exactly the kind of contamination a defense attorney would one day try to argue had happened. It's a strange kind of patience, keeping something that precise, that fragile, safe for that long, on nothing but the hope that the science around it would eventually catch up. Then, in 2017, investigators tried something newer and stranger. They hired a company that specializes in DNA phenotyping, a technique that attempts to predict physical characteristics like face shape, skin tone, eye and hair color, directly from a DNA sample, essentially building an approximate portrait of a person who had never been photographed or identified. It gave them a rough sketch of a face. It did not give them a name. That came the following year, in 2018, and it came from somewhere nobody investigating this case could have predicted. A woman in Vancouver, Washington, named Brandy Jennings, who had absolutely nothing to do with Cedar Rapids, Iowa, or Michelle Martinko, or anyone connected to either. After her father passed away in 2009, Brandy decided, out of simple curiosity, to learn more about his side of the family. In 2018, she uploaded her own DNA to GEDmatch, a free, public genealogy database people use to find relatives and build family trees, the same kind of ordinary personal project millions of people do every year. She uploaded it, and then, as she put it herself, she basically forgot about it. She had no idea that her DNA sat in that database as a genetic breadcrumb leading straight toward a killer she had never heard of. Investigators working the phenotyping company's data ran the crime scene profile against the public database and got a hit. Brandy Jennings showed up as a distant relative, a second cousin twice removed, connected through her paternal great-grandparents. From that single thread, genetic genealogists began building outward, generation by generation, the same painstaking work of marriage records and death certificates and family trees that has cracked open cold case after cold case across the country in the last several years. It's slow, unglamorous work, closer to what a hobbyist does on a Sunday afternoon, researching their own ancestry than anything you'd picture from a crime drama. No dramatic lab reveal, no flashing red match on a screen. Just names, dates, and marriages, charted out branch by branch until an entire family tree narrows down to one man whose age and location fit what the evidence required. That thread eventually led them to a man named Jerry Lynn Burns, 65 years old, living in Manchester, Iowa, a small town not far from Cedar Rapids. He had worked for John Deere. He co-owned a truck stop. He had, as far as any neighbor or co-worker could tell, an entirely unremarkable life. He had once, years earlier, lost his wife Patricia to suicide in 2008, a private tragedy that had nothing to do with Michelle Martinko, but that, in hindsight, becomes one more detail in the strange, sad accumulation of a life nobody had ever thought to look at closely. Genetic genealogy narrowed the entire country down to a name. It could not, on its own, prove anything in a courtroom. For that, investigators needed a fresh, direct sample of Burns' own DNA to compare against the blood on Michelle's dress. So they began quietly watching him, the same way detectives in similar cases have done again and again, waiting for him to do something completely ordinary, something he'd throw away without a second thought. That opportunity came at a restaurant, where Burns discarded a plastic drinking straw after finishing his drink. Investigators collected it along with the rest of his trash. It was one of more than 125 different DNA samples police had collected during the course of this investigation, from more than 125 different people who all, at some point, became names on a narrowing list. Only one of those samples matched the blood from 1979. It was the straw. I want to pause here for a second because I think about this detail a lot. A woman on the other side of the country uploaded her own DNA out of simple curiosity about her father's family, then genuinely forgot she'd done it. And a man finished a drink at a restaurant and threw the straw away without thinking twice. Neither of them had any idea what they were setting in motion. That's the strange, quiet mechanism behind almost every genetic genealogy case like this one. The past doesn't get uncovered by some dramatic act of detection. It gets uncovered because ordinary people do ordinary things, and DNA simply doesn't forget any of it. And while we're here, I do want to know who's sitting with me through this one. If you're watching right now, drop your country and the time where you are down in the comments. I love seeing exactly how far these stories travel, and how many different corners of the world we end up sharing them in. Just your country and your time, and then let's go back to Iowa, because Jerry Burns' quiet, unremarkable life was about to end in the same courtroom where he once denied ever knowing Michelle Martinko at all. Burns was arrested on December 19, 2018, 39 years to the day after Michelle's murder. He was 64 years old at the time. Police questioned him at his workplace in Manchester. He denied killing her. When they told him his DNA had been found at the scene of a decades-old murder, he had no explanation for how that could possibly be true. He was formally charged with first-degree murder shortly afterward. The trial that followed took time to even begin, partly delayed, and ultimately relocated entirely out of Cedar Rapids, moved to Scott County District Court in Davenport because of how much pre-trial publicity the case had generated locally. An entire community that had waited 40 years for this moment and could not, understandably, pretend to be neutral about it. Testimony finally began in February of 2020. Friends who had known Michelle since elementary school took the stand, describing, more than 4 decades later, the last ordinary conversation they'd had with her in that parking lot, a memory they'd apparently carried, sharp and intact, for their entire adult lives. Prosecutors laid out the physical case in stark terms. Michelle had been stabbed multiple times, her lungs and aorta pierced, roughly a third of her blood lost at the scene. Investigators testified about how the case evidence had been preserved for decades, waiting for forensic science to catch up to it. A criminalist walked the jury through the DNA matching process that connected the blood on Michelle's dress, decades old, degraded, painstakingly preserved, to the sample lifted from a discarded drinking straw in 2018. One investigator raised the possibility, based on materials found during the case, that Burns may have had a documented interest in violent content that could speak to motive, though prosecutors were careful about how much weight they placed on that theory. The defense pushed back hard on how the evidence had been handled and stored across 4 decades, suggesting contamination could explain the DNA match, an argument the jury ultimately did not accept. The jury began deliberating in the early afternoon. It did not take them long to reach a decision. On February 24, 2020, the jury convicted Jerry Lynn Burns of first-degree murder. Reporters covering the case described it simply as Michelle's Day, more than 40 years after her death. On August 7th of that same year, Burns was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He would later appeal the conviction, arguing the evidence hadn't proven his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, and raising questions about witness credibility. In March of 2023, the Iowa Supreme Court denied that appeal entirely and upheld the conviction. Jerry Lynn Burns will spend the rest of his life in prison for a murder he spent 39 years insisting, right up until a straw proved otherwise, had absolutely nothing to do with him. There is one more detail in this case that I think about even more than the straw, and it's not a comfortable one. Burns had a cousin named Brian Burns. In 2013, on December 19th, the exact anniversary of Michelle Martinko's murder, Brian Burns went missing. His remains weren't found until November of 2023, 10 years later, in an area near Manchester. Investigators have said they don't believe Jerry Burns was involved in his cousin's disappearance, and there's no evidence connecting the 2 cases. But the date sits there anyway, uncomfortable and unexplained. One Iowa family carrying 2 disappearances that happened to land on the exact same day of the year, decades apart. Sometimes a coincidence really is only a coincidence. It's still the kind of detail that makes a case like this refuse to feel finished, even after a life sentence and a denied appeal. Michelle Martinko was 18 years old. She spent the last ordinary evening of her life exactly the way an 18-year-old should be allowed to spend an evening. Singing with her choir, laughing with old friends she happened to run into at the mall, thinking about a winter coat, and somewhere just beyond that, about the interior design career she was already planning for herself at Iowa State. She never got to become the woman that plan was building toward. Her family spent 40 years attending anniversaries of a crime with no name attached to it, watching detectives rotate through a department, watching the world outside change entirely, while their own private December night in 1979 never moved forward at all. For 39 years, the man who took her life lived a few dozen miles away, worked an ordinary job, ran a small business, buried a wife of his own, and carried on a life nobody had any reason to look at twice. It took a distant relative's forgotten curiosity about her own family tree and one plastic straw thrown away without a second thought to finally close the distance between 1979 and the truth. He will die in prison. She never got the chance to grow old at all. Rest in peace, Michelle Martinko. See you in the next case.